Welcome back! In this episode, I'm going to talk about functions in processing. If you want something to repeat multiple times, it's easy to call a function instead of typing all your code over again. To create a function, I'm in an empty project here. Type out void. I'll explain what void means in a minute. Then the name of the function with two parentheses like this. Cloud parenthesis. Now, use a curly bracket like we did for a for loop earlier. Then a return, and make sure that your curly bracket is closed with the ending curly bracket. Inside of a function, code is tabbed over once to indicate that it's a part of the function. This is courtesy when writing, so it's easier to understand what's going on, just like for loops. Inside of the function, just write the code you want repeated. I want to draw a cloud, so I'm going to create 3 circles with no stroke. Now to call this function, you need to make another function. In processing, to keep things straight, almost every program has a setup function that looks like this, void setup. This makes sure the code inside of setup is run only once when the program starts. This is important for when we get to animations, so we know what is being drawn repeatedly and what is being drawn only once. It may not make much difference now, but calling a function outside of setup will throw an error. So, this is what we have to do. Void setup and then cloud with opening and closing parentheses, semicolon. So let's run the program and see what it looks like. Ah, that's a cloud all right, but let's make it more of a sky and have a bigger canvas. I'll create a size of, let's say 800, 500. And the background will be a nice blue RGB. It's normal to have these commands in the setup function since you only want to set them once. Now, if I want to create another cloud, I can't just call cloud again because that will just create 2 clouds on top of each other. Let me demonstrate. Cloud, cloud. I've called it twice, but it only shows up once on our sky because it's printing the cloud in the exact same position. So how can I change the values inside of a function? Let me introduce you to parameters. Inside of the parentheses for the cloud function, let's create a variable for the x position of the cloud, like this, int cloud x. Now, using that variable for the x position of the circles, I can copy and paste that here, and then I can just add 15. And for this one, I have to add 30. Now when I'm calling cloud, I have to plug in the different values. Let's say 40 for the first one, and let's put another cloud at 100. Now we have 2 clouds. What if I wanted to have clouds go all the way across the screen, like this? I could use a loop for that. For loops would work, but what if I don't know how wide the screen was? When we want to loop for an undetermined amount of time, we can use a while loop. To create a while loop, let's first have a variable to keep track of cloud x position inside of the setup function. Let's put it right here. So you remember how to create variables, just int cloud x, and let's set the first cloud to be at 40. I can call it the same thing in the function because here it's inside the setup function, but here it's a parameter. This is another benefit of functions, is that variables don't reach everywhere in your code, so you could reuse names and not worry about accessing variables your code shouldn't access. Now to write the while loop, let's type while, and then parentheses afterwards, and then we have the brackets and the closing brackets. We're going to be repeating this cloud command, so that'll be the thing that we're looping around in our while. Now, we need the expression inside of the while's parentheses. Inside of the parentheses for the while loop, we have to type in the condition for the loop to continue. That means what should be true if we want the while loop to continue. Now we don't want the while loop to run forever because that can break your program. So be careful when writing these. I want clouds to be printed to the end of the screen, so when the cloud x reaches the end, the loop should stop. So if I use the less than operator to tell the while loop as long as cloud x is less than the width of the entire screen, you can continue making clouds. In this case, I want it to be less than 800, which is the width of the canvas. But in case the canvas changes, I can use this handy variable, width. This is very convenient because processing already has the useful values width and height stored inside of it, and I can access it anywhere in my program. Now, two things should happen in this while loop. We create a cloud, but we also need to increment the cloud_x variable so that the loop will eventually end. So I'll tell cloud_x to add 60 to itself for each new cloud. And I almost forgot, we need to call cloud with the cloud_x variable inside of the parameters. Now it'll print clouds out until it reaches the end of the page. When you write a while loop, think very hard about how the counter variable changes, and make sure the condition will eventually become false. Infinite loops are not cool. Looks great. But let's say we want the clouds to loop not just to the end, but to the bottom of the page as well. Have multiple rows of clouds going to the end, so it's a cloud-filled sky. Right now, we only control the x value of the clouds with our cloud function. Let's add another parameter, a variable that we pass to a function, to control the y value. To create another parameter, I'll just use a comma, and then do the same thing that we did before, but call it cloud_y. But right now, we're not using cloud_y, so I'll copy it and paste it where the y element for the circles are. But now, our cloud needs two parameters, cloud_x and cloud_y. And if I want cloud_y to change, I need to have another variable in setup for cloud_y. So now I just use a comma and pass it cloud_y. So cloud_x matches with cloud_x, cloud_y matches with cloud_y. Right now, we're never changing the cloud_y value, so it will stay the same. So let's change the y value after the clouds are finished printing in a row. We can do that with an if statement inside of the while loop. An if statement is just the word if, and then the conditional, and then the brackets indicating what code we want if that conditional is true. So if cloud_x has reached the end, then we want to add to our cloud_y value. And then reset cloud_x to be what it originally was, 40. That way, when the new row of clouds happens, the first cloud is where it's supposed to be. But there's still an issue, is that our while loop is currently checking if cloud_x is less than width, so this if will never happen. So let's change the while loop to not be if cloud_x is less than width, if cloud_y is less than the height. Now it will stop when cloud_y is at max height at the bottom of the canvas. Nice. Beautiful. Look at all those clouds. But I think this could use a little bit of variety. An easy way to implement some changes is using that random function that we used last episode. If you remember from last episode, it takes two parameters, the minimum and maximum value. I'd like the starting cloud_x to change after each row, something between 20 and 60. Let's do random 20, 60. The random function takes two parameters, the min value and the max value. Processing is throwing an error. The random function returns a float, which is a decimal. And cloud_x is an integer, and you can't assign a float, which could be something like 20.3, 34.8, or 59.9, into cloud_x, which is a whole number. So, we could change cloud_x to be a float everywhere in our program, but I think it would be easier just to cast this to an int. What casting means is that you take a variable like a float, and you convert it into an integer by rounding, and we can do that with the int command. This will cast whatever's inside of it to an integer, and that fixes the error right there. Let's see what that looks like. That's very nice. Now we have some subtle but very pleasing distortions in the clouds. Sometimes we get more intense bends in the clouds, which is really cool. I really enjoy the randomness in processing and how you can make your art look very cool each time you run it. There, that's some nice positional variety. I hope you enjoyed this episode about functions and you feel confident on creating your own processing projects. See you next time. I'm Josh.